Hey, so thank you all for again attending today. I know we are here to learn more from Dr. Frederick Krates, who will be talking more on the operational flood forecasting system at Google. Yeah, without further ado, Frederick, why don't you take it away? Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah, happy to be here again. This is my second time that I was actually invited to give a talk here. To my understanding, the last talk was also recorded, and the last talk was more about the background on why we chose the model that we use and all this kind of stuff. So this will be a talk that's a bit more high level. It's about the Google flood forecasting team as a whole, why we do this, and also including data from a recent paper that we did together with ECWF. So kind of one of the first questions that people are always asking is, why is Google doing flood forecasts? And the answer is actually pretty easy. People come to Google to get information, all kinds of information, and people also come to Google to ask about environmental hazards and floodings. So providing data for any kind of user requested searches is by definition the design, the core task that Google likes to serve. So providing information for flooding is just one of them. And because information about flood forecast is not globally available or not at the level that we wanted it to see, this is why Google started this entire flood forecasting project. But Google, or specifically the team to which also the flood forecasting team belongs, like we do more stuff than just flood forecasting. There's also warnings on wildfires, earthquakes, hurricanes, extreme heat, and then floods. And because so many people use some service from Google, it's very easy for Google to effectively distribute whatever kind of warning we provide directly to the end user via Google Search, via push notification on Google Maps. And these are not only warnings and alerts that we get through in-house models, but we also work together with a lot of like governments and NGOs and other agencies. So whenever a national agency, for example, issues a CAP alert for a region, this is also shown and distributed to end users on Google Search and Maps. So if you at the moment look for where and how Google distributes our flood forecast, the place to go is what we call the Flood Hub. If you would go to Flood Hub, the link is g.co/floodhub. You will see this homepage. Then if you zoom in, you get like pins in the rivers and you can click on them. It will look something like this. And you get an up to 7-day forecast of how the stream flow is predicted from our in-house model, together with some warning and danger levels. And these are usually like 2-year, 5-year return periods. We also have extreme danger 20-year return period, denoted with a different color. And then in some of the places where we issue forecasts, the model is also coupled with an inundation model. So then you will also see the inundated area that our model predicts for the given AOI. So usually like an area around the point in the river for which we issue the forecast. The data in FloodHub basically comes from a single model. I will come to this later. There are a few differences. So we have 5 countries with which we initially started. Actually, with those countries, we have specific partner contracts, and they provide us data in real time. So in a lot of the places of their countries, we actually run autoregressive models. So we use their real-time streamflow data as input to generate more accurate forecasts. But these are only 5 of the countries in the world. For the rest of the world, our model is, you could say, a pure simulation forecast model that only sees meteorological inputs, hindcast and forecast, static catchment attributes, and basically can be applied everywhere. And I will go a bit more into detail about these systems. So the flood forecasting team is split into three different parts. One is the hydrology model, one is the inundation model, and then one is what we call platforms and warning distributions. I am personally part of the hydro model team, so my task basically ends at the point where I can predict how much water volume is in the river. And then there's the inundation model, which takes our stream flow forecast and provides wherever they are able to do. So we're not able to do this everywhere, but in a lot of places, they provide inundated area forecasts. And then, as I mentioned previously, we have various different channels on how we can distribute our warnings effectively directly to end users. But we're not only we're not only sharing our warnings to end users. We also work very closely together with different NGOs like the Red Cross, the Red Moon, and all these kind of international NGOs, and provide them our forecasts basically in a more direct manner. I see there are already questions in chat. I will answer your questions later. I have actually plenty of time planned for a Q&A, so we will definitely have enough time to talk about this. So, yeah, I mentioned initially that the project started earlier with just partner countries. So this is the kind of data that we currently use to train our model. But when the flood forecasting team started in 2017, it actually started as just a small pilot project in a small village in India. Then a year later was extended to more villages in northern India. And then in 2019, it was extended to India and Bangladesh. And now we are basically semi-global, I would say. Yeah, so let's see. The model that we use, and again, I recommend that if you want to learn like much more details and why we chose this model and how the model works in more details, there's this other talk that I gave in this seminar, I think last year, just on the model architecture and why LSTM and how exactly our model, what are the inputs and all this kind of stuff. The only thing I want to say here for everybody who's not familiar, so we use models based on the deep learning architecture called long short-term memory network. This is a kind of, it's a recurrent neural network and a sequential model that processes inputs in temporal order. And it also has internal states. So when I initially came up with this idea to try this model, I was still doing my master in hydrology, and I was learning about these conceptual hydrology models that are usually like kind of bucket models where you have like a bucket of groundwater, a bucket of soil moisture, a bucket for snow. And then you have these hard-coded functions with some free parameters, how precipitation like percolate, infiltrates, and then generate stream flow. This model is essentially the same, with the only difference that you do not predefine how the meteorological inputs, precipitation, is stored intermediate and finally generates water. But the model itself learns from data what's the processes that are important for predicting discharge. But really, and there's some history on this in the papers, this is really just a general state space model that can in principle just be a conceptual hydrology model that is just learned from data. And then for the hydrologist in the room, what we usually do is we model gauges in what we call LAMP, right? LAMP means that the input features to predict a certain point in the river are the spatially aggregated features of the upstream area. In literature, there's like a kind of a threshold up to which area this assumption should work and when you should start to do distributed modeling, we actually see that it works quite well, especially on like daily temporal resolution. Also for much larger areas. We are currently also working on fully distributed models, but the current model that you see running on FlatHub essentially is a model that runs lumps. So every point that you see forecasted considers the entire upstream area as an aggregated block. Okay. And then, so I just created this slide recently, but it's already kind of outdated. So this is the data that we use for training our models. We don't use a single meteorological data set when running our models. And then if we would have wait, I would start the other way around. So first, what we do is we don't use a single precipitation or meteorological data set in our model, but instead provide the model at once with everything we have available. And you can basically separate it into like precipitation or meteorological data that we have in hindcasts or up to now, and then different forecast products. Until recently, the only meteorological weather forecast in our model was the ECMWF HRES forecast. Now we also additionally use the GraphCast model forecast from DeepMind that probably some of you have heard of. And then we have various different precipitation products, meteorological weather products that we use in the hindcast. So this is IMERC precipitation, CPC, and then ERA5 land mixed with HRES. And then most of our training data comes from GRDC, a global runoff data set. But this is combined with other publicly available Streamflow data sources. And then also, as I said previously, we have some countries that provide us training data directly. I think the more traditional approach for using multiple weather products in hydrology is that you have your model and you run it once with precipitation product A and then another time with precipitation product B, and like this you generate an ensemble forecast. What we do instead with our model is we provide the model all the different products at once. And we could actually show that by this it learns the synergy between different products, because product A might be good for convective storm and the other one might be good for precipitation in the upper north and all of kind of this. And the model effectively is able to learn how to combine the different products to generate better quality forecasts. And then our model outputs not a single discharge forecast, but actually a distribution. So currently we don't show this on FlatHub, but our model actually outputs a probability distribution for each time step over discharge. So there's just like, I have there's like two slides now on the model architecture, but this is just that we have something to discuss later. So in general, if I say we use LSTM, we actually do much more stuff around it, but like general, I hope you don't hear the background noise. My neighbors just started construction works in their apartment and it's like very loud here, but I hope it works. So yeah, if we say we use an LSTM, actually the kind of deep learning model has much more building blocks, but the LSTM is like the time processing brain of the model, if you want to say so, the main component. And one of our first architectures that we used for forecasting actually consisted of two different LSTMs. So two LSTM layers with different sets of weights that you see like as the blue squares here. And then we had this one LSTM that basically processed the meteorological history up to today. Let's say we want to forecast an issue starting today. So we have this one LSTM in dark blue that processes the entire history of meteorological data until today. Then it generates some intermediate states that it hands off to a second LSTM. And the second LSTM is actually fed with the weather forecast and then generates the predictions. So this was like the kind of the first model that we had. This is also the model that was used in the paper that recently or is about to come out in Nature. The preprint is already on arXiv with ECMWF, but it's actually like already 2 generations old. So we use, I will now show you our last model that is still currently on FlatHub, but again, already outdated. And I just show you all of this. First of all, we are always very open about how we build the model, but also to show you that we continuously work on this model and try to make it better and try different things. And there's not like one model, right? It's a continuous process of making the model better. So then we saw some problems with how the model handoff worked, and there were like some drifting patterns in the forecasting part of the LSTM. So instead of having these 2 kind of different models stacked in time, we instead built like a kind of a 2-layer LSTM where we have the first layer that processes only the historical part of the forcings. And then we have a second layer which kind of sees the data shifted and is now combined with the meteorological weather forecast that is then finally able to predict again in the green squares at the end the stream flow forecast. Specifically, what was the problem that we have with the old model that was solved by this model was that we had kind of a drifting hairs pattern, so that we were seeing that our model had like a continuous trend of drifting hairs in the forecast. So if you plot not the forecast, like if you would plot the forecast as like the short 7-day line of multiple days after each other, you would see that there's like a constant kind of drifting pattern. This was removed by this architecture, but again, this is currently the version that runs on FlatHub, but it will be an update in May. So, yeah, one thing that's probably not like super clear to everybody in the room who's not familiar with LSTMs, it's worth to highlight that we actually train a single model on the data of all of the world. It's not like in hydrology where usually you get the best model if you train a model for each river individually. Instead, with these deep learning models, you usually train a model on as much data as possible, a single model. And then you can use this single model with a single set of weights to basically predict any river. The advantage is that this model has seen various different kinds of rivers and is able to generalize within a river to events that it has never seen in this region. But because it has seen other rivers in other regions, it knows what to do. And there's a paper that is currently in HES discussions where we looked into this in more detail. This is nothing new. This is like actually something that we published in 2019. I include this because if you look at literature, and I get asked to review a lot of these papers, this is like, I would say, the number one mistake that people still doing when they train LSTM models. You really, really, really don't want to use these models if you train them on a single basin. So what you see here is the performance of a model over a fixed data set that consists of roughly 500 basins. And now we trained a couple of different models, and for each setting, we trained repetitions and all this kind of stuff. So in blue, what you see, these are models being trained on different basin group sizes. So we randomly picked 10 basins, 50 basins, 100 basins, and so on. Did this like in a K-fold cross-validation fashion and repeated this multiple times. And here you see like the aggregated statistics of everything. And what you can see is that if you then evaluate these models over all of the basins, you see that with increase in the training set size, the model becomes better and better. And it's specifically worth to say, because this is something that people sometimes miss. These models are actually not a lot better than conceptual hydrology models if you train them on a single basin. the true power that makes these models better is if you train them on a lot of diverse data, because only then they're able to like understand how to predict something that they have not seen in this one basin. The other thing that we showed here in orange and green is what happens if you train a model based on regional cluster splits. So these are the hydrological units in the US and CONUS. So you can just say these are like regional cluster splits. And in green, what happens if you train a model, but you cluster the basins based on catchment attributes? And then for each of these clusters, you train one model. And you can see that still training a model just on random gauge groups, the blue line, is better than training a model on small regions. And it gets also better than on attribute clusters if you just showed everything. Yeah, okay. And this is maybe just like kind of a repetition of what I already said. Here, it's like a figure that shows the difference of how the performance of hydrology models usually gets worse if you go from like models that you calibrate in a regional fashion versus the same model being calibrated to each basin individually. So these are like the orange solid line and the blue solid line on the left-hand plot. Just like the same model, then the corresponding dashed line, but trained for each basin individually. And if you would take the same model, but you set it up with like a regional calibration setup, you get a model performance that's much worse. And with the LSTM, it's reverse. If you train the same model on the same data, but you train one model for all basins instead of small models for each basin individually, you get a better model by training just one model. Okay, so the blue. These are like CDFs over the NSE. So the further a line is to the right, the better the model. Again, I see there are some questions. We will come to all of your questions. But I will answer them later. So another benefit, and you can see more details in this paper that's currently in HES discussion. Another benefit of training a regional model is that the regional LSTM, so this deep learning model trained on many basins, is able to capture more extreme events than a model that you would train on each basin individually. This has to do with saturating effects within the model architecture and distributions over the discharge space and all this kind of stuff. But just the quintessence is that if you train a model on just a single basin, what you get is a model that is not able to predict something that is higher than a certain value that you see during training. If you in this particular basin. Now, if you train LSTM on many basins together, what you get is a model that is perfectly able to predict much higher, much rarer floods in a basin that it has never seen such high events during training. Okay. Again, more information on this is in this paper. And now I mentioned that we did this study together with ECMWF. So for some of you might know that one of the I would say most state-of-the-art global flood forecasting systems is the GLOPHOS model by ECMWF. So they run, I think they update it once per day or every 12 hours or something. They run the GLOPHOS system with, I think, a 10-day forecast or something for all of the world with the same inputs that we actually use with the ECMWF HREF weather forecast. And we did a study together with ECMWF comparing our flood forecasting system to their flood forecasting system for like the same stations. And the result is that our flood forecasting system is as good in predicting stream flow with a 5-day lead time, actually even 6-day lead time, Then GloFast model for the 0 daily time. So whatever we predict 6 days ago, 6 days into the future is as good as what GloFast says will happen today. And then if the same data, but like evaluated slightly different, our model is able, I'd say, has a similar precision in predicting 5-year events than GloFast has in predicting 1-year flood events. And then because there often comes the question about calibration metrics and stuff like this, so GloFast is being calibrated on the KGE metric. And if we evaluate our model on the KGE metric, the flood forecasting system that we operate is as good in the KGE space in ungauged locations, so in basins that it has never seen during training, than GloFast in the calibration stations. So for stations for which they calibrate their model, we are as good if we predicted these stations without ever seeing training data from these stations. Unfortunately, I would say we are not able to reliably predict where one model is better than the other. So we tried different things and trying to see, because it's not that we are better in every river or in any scenario, right? So there would be a value to know, oh, in this station or this period or in this climate or whatever, model A is better than model B. But whatever we tried, we were not able to predict which model is better than the other for a given location. And yeah, with that, I'm almost at the end. I just want to say that everything that I mentioned today, we basically openly publish everything, and we maintain like an open source library that I started still during my PhD, in which we integrate basically all of our models and everything we publish, so that people are able to reproduce our studies and also use the code for their own research. So you can find basically all the links on the homepage that is listed here. And if you have questions on this, you can also reach out to me. So there are like data sets, code, links to all papers and everything. And with that, I'm done with my presentation, and we can come to the questions that I see are already popping up in the chat. I just take a drink of water.
Thanks so much, Fredrik, for your great presentation. I see a lot of questions here. Do you want to go ahead and read some of those, or do you...
Sure, I can start. Okay, so the first question, if we are planning to release an API so that people can use our forecast, and yes, actually we do, and I think it's going live pretty soon. So we are currently in kind of a beta test. There will be a standard API that you can query to get forecast, but also to get basically the full historic reforecast for every station. Also, I think I could share this. So Flutter currently has like a very limited view for the user. Let me go back. It looks like this, right? So if you go to GloFast, it looks completely different. Like you have a lot of different symbols and a lot of different information, and you can view the data in many different forms. When we started our project, again, like our focus was not the main target area was not like provide forecasts in Europe or the US and give forecasts to forecast centers that operate their own model and have their own data. It was mainly targeted to the global south, where like for a lot of regions, there are absolutely no forecasts available, and people themselves really struggle to understand the GloFast portal if you're not like a hydrology or data science expert. So the UI decision behind flood hub initially, and also how we issue our alerts on like Google search and everywhere, was keeping in mind that we target people that some of them don't even know how to read and have never seen maps before, and to really not have us seen like graphs and probability distributions and box plots and all this kind of stuff. So we kind of really trying to aim for the minimal information approach. That being said, we do work together with a lot of NGOs, and they have their data science team that usually wants to get much more information. So we are also working on an expert view within FluttHub that will provide much more information than what I would say the normal user will see when he just enters the homepage. This will potentially also go live sometimes this year. I don't know exactly when, but this is something that will definitely come. I can also say we have this model. So if you look on the map here, you see there it's not super dense, it's still sparse. We actually have this model running everywhere. We are predicting live, I think something in the order of 300,000 points on the world. A lot of these stations, however, of course, are ungauged stations, right? But we can apply our model to any river anywhere in the world. But it's a bit tricky how to communicate if a location is quality validated. So every gauge that you see at the moment on FluttHub is kind of quality validated. Versus non-quality validated stations, right? So the expert view definitely will also include stations where our model is applied fully ungauged, but with a lot of disclaimers that this is an ungauged prediction. We cannot perfectly tell you if in this river our model is good or not, but then an expert in the forecasting domain should know how to work with this kind of information. The general user that we aim for probably doesn't. Okay, that was much more than I wanted to say. There's a question on how do you train LSTM with multiple station data? Multiple stations have multiple sequences. Do you ignore time and just combine sequences? No, actually, okay. If we think about just the data shape that you feed into the deep learning model, one training sample and one inference sample, it's just the sequence, a time slice for one basin. So it's time sequence times number of features. And what we combine in the feature dimension is metrological time series feature and, super important, static catchment attributes. So these static catchment attributes allow the model to understand why sequence A leads to a different discharge signal than sequence B. Imagine you have 2 times exactly the same meteorological data sequence, like a year of precipitation and temperature data, 2 times exactly the same, but one is over a catchment that is fully covered in forest, and the other one is over a catchment that is pure bare soil. Of course, this would result in completely different discharge responses. So the only way the model is able to understand that in one, there's forest that absorbs and stores water and buffers the signal, and in the other one, you basically get immediate runoff, is by providing this information to the model, which we feed also into the LSTM at every time step. So then to train this model, you can imagine you build a set of possible samples over all basins, and now you create these mini batches. You take one training sample from basin A, one training sample from basin B. You randomly sample them from all the available training samples. You feed them into your model, and then the model over time sees all your basins and all your time slices and is able to learn through them. So yeah, I think maybe the trick, the 2 things that raised your concern is, so a single input sample is just for a single basin, and B, very important, combine the inputs into the model with static catchment attributes so that the model is actually able to understand the difference between different locations. Okay, the next question is your takeaway regarding training LSTMs versus other networks on regional training data versus basin level training data. Plots with the blue and yellow curves. Oh yeah, okay, this is one of my most favorite topics to talk about. Okay, so I think if you come from hydrology, this is the best plot to start with. I think everybody who has a background in hydrology and does rainfall runoff modeling will agree that if you want to get the best results in a particular basin, the best thing that you can do is you take your hydrology model, let it be SEXMA, HBV, JR4J, whatever, and you calibrate it specifically for this one river, right? And now, this is what you see here. So the data behind these graphs come from, again, roughly 500 different basins in the ChemLS US dataset. And the data in the left plot was calibrated by the developers of the VIC model and the calibrators of the developers of the MHM model. So what they did was they took their own in-house model and they once did their best effort in calibrating the VIC and MHM model for each of the 500 basins individually. And this is, wait, I'm confused now. This is, I think the legend is wrong. So the solid lines in the left-hand plot, the orange solid line is MHM calibrated to each basin individually, and the it's correct. And the orange dashed line is VIC model being calibrated to each basin individually. And now, if you take the same model but you apply one of these regional calibration methods, which usually they have like some transfer functions mapping from catchment characteristics to model parameters of VIC or MHM. You get much worse results. So this is now the blue lines. Again, the solid line corresponds to the MHM model and the dashed line corresponds to the VIC model. And if you just compare the two blue lines or the two orange lines, you see that the solid line, the per basin calibrated model, is much better than the regional model. And again, these are like CDF plots. So if you're not familiar with them, the metric, the Nash-Sutcliffe efficiency is on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the cumulative density function. And always for me, like an easy way to get these functions is if you would draw a horizontal line on 0.5. Now the intersection with each of these lines, if you then go down to the x-axis, is the median model performance, right? So if we take, for example, the blue solid line, we draw a horizontal line. We then go down and we will be like the median model performance of MHM regional calibrated is maybe slightly at 0.5 or something, right? NSE. And then if you look at the LSTM, the trend is reversed. That's like the main thing to understand here, that actually the blue lines are now further to the right than the orange lines. And the orange lines are LSTMs, hyperparameter tuned and trained individually for each of the 500 basins, same data period, same basins. And the blue lines is a single LSTM being trained on all 500 basins together. Again, combining static and catchment attributes. I saw some up. I think that was you. Yeah. So that's the main takeaway. And there's like an entire paper. It's like if you go to Hess homepage and then you look for Hess opinions currently in discussion or something, you will find it. And the title is "Never Train an LSTM on a Single Basin." So this, like, you really shouldn't do that. And there's some history in this paper why I think it's worth writing an opinion paper about this. Yeah, so GloFast. Okay, that's not a question. That's just yeah, you need an account to check the GloFast dashboard. I will not share this now, but everybody can. It's a free account. You can just create one. I think it's better to go through this yourself. Okay, are there any other questions? Also, again, I was very high level with all of our modeling stuff that we do. If you want any more details on any specific part, just feel free to ask. There are no secrets.
Yeah, I have a question on the the static catchment attributes. So are you putting those attributes as a additional feature in your sequence when you are developing those sequence for your LSTM?
Yes, usually we do. So here you see basically, so these kind of more narrowish rectangles should represent the vector. And the vector consists of the dynamic features, so features that change over time, like precipitation temperature, and then in red, the static features. And the static features are really just added to the dynamic features at every time step. So they're just, you repeat them in time and you concatenate them to your sequence. And of course, you can now say, static features don't have to be static over 40 years, right? Like if you have a static features like land use, forest fraction, this can change over 40 years or 50 years in your catchment. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that you cannot update them in your model. And you do this already during training. You show your model how the catchment develops over time, and then it can learn the connection between how the discharge signal changes, given that some of the static attributes also changes. So for example, we saw this with wildfires. We have some catchments in our training data that saw severe wildfires. And if you do not provide any information to the model that something happened, it was assuming that there's still a forest and it was predicting a much more smooth and buffered forecasting signal. But if you provide the model with hints that a large fraction of the forest is gone and is currently like burned, dry soil, just bare soil basically, the discharge response gets much spikier. So when we say static, what we usually mean is that they are static over the time horizon of this one input sequence that we feed into the model, but they don't have to be static for basin over 48 years or whatever training data you have.
Okay.
And then also usually we have much more static features than we have dynamic features. So you don't just put 200 static features to your, 15 meteorological features, but instead we have like a small embedding network that down projects the static features to, dimension 15 or 20 or whatever. So you get like a more compactified representation of your static features. And then this is fed to the LSTM.
Okay, thank you. One last question that I have is, so within Servier, like we work in data scarce region like Asia and Africa, right? It's very difficult to get those data. You talk a little bit about releasing the API so people could go and take those forecasts. But is there also plan to release some of the model weights? So, if you have data for some country that you want to maybe transfer along using some of these global or regional models, is there any plan for that? And I don't know, how useful do you think this would be for like a hydrological community?
So in general, I think it's useful. We are at the point that I would say it starts to become not so simple anymore for people to reproduce our experiments end to end. Like So everything that I did during my PhD was mostly experiments with the CamelCS data set that you can train these models on your laptop. It takes like 3 hours and everything happens in memory and that works super fast. We are at the point that using multiple different forecast products and then like 10, 15, 20,000 different gauges with 40 years of data, we are at the point that like just handling the data becomes, I would say, not so easy without using like distributed data infrastructure. And then even though the models are still small, the distributed models that we train actually do require multiple GPU, DPU training. So, and then I think pre-training a model on all data and then releasing this model, even if it's just a lumped LSTM, for people to actually then just fine-tune it on their, there is a value, definitely. I actually think, I'm not 100% sure because I was not the lead author on the Nature paper. I think as part of what we published for this paper with ECWF, we also published a saved Keras model. Now, it's like there are ways how you can get just the weights of the Keras model, and then you can basically use trained weights, build your own model, and start fine-tuning it. Like saved Keras models are not ideal for like continuing to train. You would actually need the checkpoints. So it's like it's a bit a framework hustle. This has mostly to do for how we train our models internally. So what we did for this paper was we provided a one-to-one replication of our model in PyTorch within the neural hydrology library, but you would need to train from scratch. And then we provided this, I think, is saved Keras model. I mean, if you're hacky enough, there's a way how you can like get the weights from the saved Keras model and plunge them into the PyTorch LSTM implementation. It's not super straightforward. Definitely something that, hopefully gets better in the future. It's a bit of a hassle with TensorFlow, sharing models with TensorFlow. Yeah, also what you posted, I think now this is a link to like an old research blog that I wrote or started during my PhD. There's also a Python package called Neural Hydrology that you will find on this blog, but you can also just go to github.com/neuralhydrology/neuralhydrology. It's a Python library, right? Yes, library. And I used for all of my research this library, and also two of my colleagues, we did all experiments for all papers with this library, and you can reproduce anything we did with this Python library. And I mean, okay, I created this library. Of course, I like it, but I would stress that instead of just the library, the thing we built this library for was to be very easily extendable to new models, new data sets for researchers to do research. It's not a library that was built to run operational models. It's a research library with the main focus point being easily extendable to new model ideas, to new data sets. So if you want to try a new model, let's say a transformer, right? Okay, everybody is using transformer now. You can take neural hydrology. There's a tutorial for how to write a new model that is then able to use all the data sets and data loader and training stuff that we provide in neural hydrology. And so if you're doing research, if you're in academia, and you just want to play around with models and quickly try stuff, this library is for you. If you look for operational stuff, probably not.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any more questions? Maybe one last question before we break up. Hearing none. I also shared the link to this paper. I'm guessing this is the paper that you're talking about, Fredrik.
Yes, exactly. It's not, it's from the version is November 3rd. So it's not one-to-one the version that was accepted for publication, which I think is currently in typesetting or something, but it's basically the last version of the paper.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Hearing no any other question. Thank you so much for coming here despite having sick kids at home, Fredrik, for taking the time. And as Fredrik mentioned, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out to Fredrik. Also share the link to this presentation and hopefully the slides in another email. And if you have any question on TensorFlow working group or the deep learning book that we're planning to write, feel free to reach out. You have my email. Yeah, thank you so much for attending and have a great rest of the day, evening, wherever you are.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.